Uh, a very warm welcome to all the participants and the resource persons joining us and across India and beyond. I, Sanchita Biswas, Deputy Manager, Spare India, delighted to welcome you today to the thematic webinar on integrating protection from sexual exploitation and abuse. Uh, Once again, sexual exploitation and abuse into disaster risk reduction, protecting rights and dignity, organized by Sphere India Academy in collaboration with UN India. Disasters, while causing large scale destruction, also deepen the existing inequalities and vulnerabilities. In such fragile context, the risk of sexual exploitation and abuse rise sharply. Women, children, persons with disabilities, elderly, and marginalized communities are disproportionately exposed to the exploitation when displacement, weakened protection system, and disruption of community structures occur. Recognizing this, the humanitarian community globally has adopted the zero tolerance toward SEA through IESE 6 core principles and UN Secretary General Bulletin on PSEA, making safeguarding an uncompromisable standard. This webinar seeks to advance the collective accountability and survival center approaches, strengthen community engagement, and promote institutionalization of PSA policies and practices. We will hear from the distinguished experts who will bring the diverse perspective ranging from legal frameworks and survival center mental health support to inclusive humanitarian action and institutional accountability. It is my privilege to introduce our moderator for today's session, Advocate Abhishek Kumar, founder and curator, the Sangyan. Advocate Abhishek Kumar is a lawyer, environmental researcher, disability rights advocate, and Indian Knowledge System IKS practitioner. He is the founder of the organization called Sangyan, an initiative working at the intersection of law, inclusion, and sustainability, with a focus on disability inclusive climate action, disaster risk reduction, and environmental protection. He serves as the national and international platforms, including National Disaster Management Authority's Core Group on Disability Group and Spare India's Protection Sector Committee. Abhishek has represented India at global forums such as 18th International Conference on Community-Based Adaptation in Tanzania, G20 Brazil Youth Pre-Summit, and upcoming 14th UNESCO Youth Forum 2025 in Uzbekistan. With his expertise and engagement in issues of justice and rights-based approaches, he will guide us through today's discussion with clarity and balance. Over to you, Abhishek.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sanchita. Namaste, and thank you for having me. And a very warm welcome to this thematic webinar, jointly organized by, as Sanchita mentioned, by Sphere India Academy and UN India on integrating protection from sexual exploitation and abuse into disaster risk reduction, protecting rights and dignity. I'm Advocate Abhishek Kumar, and I have the privilege of moderating today's discussion. This session comes at a crucial time when we are facing or witnessing a flash floods, cyclones, and so many other slow onset and fast onsets kind of disasters across India and globally. And disasters do not strike in a vacuum. They expose and intensify existing inequalities when communities are displaced, when protection systems weaken, risk of sexual exploitation and abuse rise sharply. Women, children, persons with disabilities, the elderly, and marginalized groups are disproportionately affected. Globally, we have clear standards, the Interagency Standing Committee's 6 core principles, the UN Secretary General's bulletins on PSEA, and the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction, among others, which all emphasize dignity, inclusion, agency, and accountability. In Indian context, our legal foundations like the Disaster Management Act and the National Policy on Disaster Management, and a specific laws such as POSH Act and POSCO mandate that we safeguard vulnerable groups and uphold human dignity in every phase of disaster response, which also includes about abuse and sexual exploitation. Now, with a trigger warning, I would like to share that how during my own research endeavors, exploring the impact of climate change and its induced disasters on person with disabilities, that I came across news headlines and that highlighted the grave threat climate change and it is induced disasters pose for women and girls with disabilities, among others. The first exhibit is quote, increase in disasters leads to a spike in intentional homicides of women. UN report. Second exhibit. Loot for free ration. Hindu minor girl gang raped amid floods in Park Sindh. Third exhibit. Heat waves and the risk of intimate partner violence. And the last. The shadow pandemic, violence against women during COVID 19. Couple of years back, I also had the opportunity to visit Sakhi, one-stop center in couple of districts of Jharkhand, where I witnessed cases of how COVID-19 it was also legally dealt as a disaster by the government of India, and other heat waves and floods, how they trigger abuse, sexual exploitation and violence, especially against women with disabilities and women from marginalized communities. Thus, the challenge remains the cases of abuse often go unreported due to stigma, fear, inaccessible structures, eco-ableism, and so much more. And thus, integration of PSEA and DRR is therefore not optional, it is essential. That is what brings us together today for this webinar. Over the next 90 minutes, we will discuss these different facets and aspects of this theme. And for that, we are privileged to have Miss Veenu Kakkar and ma'am from, she is a consultant at UN India Interagency and a PSEA coordinator. Before I invite her for her to give her presentation, I would like to give a small introduction about her. Veenu Kakkar has over 25 years of experience in advancing gender equality and rights, working with UN bodies, NGOs, government institutions, corporates, PSUs, and academic spaces in various capacities. She has led gender analysis and research and development specialized toolkits to ensure gender mainstreaming across planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. For the past 3 years, she has served as the interagency PSEA coordinator at the UN Resident Coordinator's Office in India, where she steers a network on PSCAH with 23 UN agencies and 3 CSOs as members. Her profile is a strengthening PSCA systems and referral pathways and building the capacity of UN staff and implementing partners to foster safe and accountable work environment. So over to you, ma'am. Yeah, welcome.
Thank you so much, Abhishek. Thank you for having me here. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Since Abhishek, I think, has already started it really well by talking about how the most vulnerable of the lot community that we have here is under threat when it comes to working on prevention of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, not just women, but also children and other vulnerable adults. So, I actually wanted to clarify right in the beginning the meanings of the term that we are talking about. We are talking really very heavy terminology here, sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, sexual harassment, sexual violence, sexual misconduct. These are terms that people use as per their own convenience because, we put our own meanings to each of these words, and rightly so. But the idea here is that we must be able to distinguish and make sure that we are demarcating the three terminologies that primarily today we are going to look at: sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, and sexual harassment. Please allow me to share my presentation because it will help everyone else to focus on my voice for all those who want to, learn from the auditory set, but also it'll be helpful if people can see something and also make sure that they're focusing there. Okay. I'm going to convert this to a slideshow. So I'm going to give you the absolute basics of the three terminologies and how it intersects today with the law that we have in the country. And that too, since I'm not a lawyer, and I don't think we need to be lawyers to be able to understand the issue well, we will keep it really basic. First and the foremost, this is a term, prevention of sexual exploitation abuse, in various forms. A lot of the UN agencies mostly, but also INGOs and NGOs are using this terminology. For example, WHO actually calls it sexual misconduct, right? Some people call it SEA, XEAH. Somebody call it PSEA. So these are terminologies that you will keep hearing very often, but don't get confused by it and understand the basic information here. What we are trying to do here is that we are trying to make sure that whenever somebody from the United Nations, and I'm very categorically stating this, that whether someone is from the United Nations or whether somebody represents the United Nations in any part of the world. So who could it be? It could be our implementing partners. It could be our partners. It could be the CSOs or the colleges or the universities we work with. But it could also be our vendors who are representing the United Nations in the field somewhere. And during this process, either as a United Nations personnel or as an implementing personnel, we tend to interact with the community that we are here to serve. And while serving the community, we need to make sure that the most vulnerable people are protected from us, the staff of the United Nations, the staff of the associated organizations. We need to make sure that in case there is a problem being reported or a concern being reported or a case of sexual exploitation and abuse being reported, we must have all the systems in place to be adequately able to respond to this complaint or a concern that is coming up. If somebody has a confusion, if somebody has seen something, witnessed something, and it's great if they're coming to us, we should be able to listen to them and guide them as to what is to be done as the next steps. And of course, while it does not sound very realistic, we would like to prevent and make sure that we end all forms of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment by any of the UN staff members, by any of the partner organizations that we work with. As you just heard from Abhishek, that we have a very active network within the country, within India. There are 23 UN agencies now that are a part of this network. In total, I think we are about 25 or 26 UN agencies. 2 or 3 of the UN agencies are very small in size in this particular country. So they may not be actively be a part of the network, but they are all the UN officers are in the ambit and the scope of the work that we are talking about here, right? The idea here is to make sure that the survivor, that's our community, our beneficiaries, are safe from anybody who works or represents with United Nations or any of the implementing partners or vendors as well. So even the third party staff that we are working with, we are responsible and accountable for their behavior as well, right? So I hope everybody's understood the scope really well. What are we aiming to do when we are talking about sexual exploitation and abuse? And you will see me using sometimes sexual exploitation abuse and sometimes H also gets in. Let me tell you very quickly how that is happening. So in terms of sexual exploitation and abuse, what we're trying to do is that we want to prevent any form of sexual abuse or exploitation that could occur in the first place with any of our community members, right? So we are trying to make sure that while we are all UN and our implementing partners are working in the field, we are trying to ensure the community is safe, right? And they're not being put through any form of sexual violence or misconduct. What we're also trying to do here is that in case there is reporting, and we hope that there is reporting if something goes wrong, then we should be able to very quickly follow up with this allegation, we should be able to efficiently and effectively, in a time-bound and transparent manner, be able to deal with the issue. And whoever the survivor is should be able to receive appropriate services as and when they require. It should all be ready and laid out on the table. Tell us what you need from us, and then they should be able to tell us. Now, make sure that you understand two things about this. And this is a very huge difference between the way United Nations is working at the moment and as of now, the laws in the country stand. When we are looking at sexual exploitation and abuse, we are very sure that it has to be a gender inclusive concept, which means that it doesn't really matter where the victim is coming from. There is absolute understanding of it could be a woman, it could be a girl, it could be a young boy, it could be a gender neutral person, it could be anyone, it could be a trans person. So we are open to looking at this issue at a more broader base. The second part of this gets even more interesting is that we understand that children are very vulnerable, right? And therefore, this is also an age agnostic concept. What also is interesting is that while in India, you have a network of 23 UN agencies and a few CSO partners who are merely representing CSOs, in fact, within the network, there are other countries which also have similar networks, right? For example, I was recently in a conference where I figured that Afghanistan has more than 1,500, like 1,500 to 2,000 people as a part of the network. We are just about 45 people. So we are all following different systems. However, there are two bodies that become extremely important. One is that making sure that PSEA work is getting done in a certain way, that on an annual basis there is a proper work plan, that there is a checks and balances are in place. There is a body called Office of the Special Coordinator on SEA, and this body is actually headed by a USG, a very senior UN employee. And USG Kristen Saunders is leading this, but there is also an interagency standing committee, which I must mention. It's one of the longest serving committees on the issue. Now, what interagency standing committee has done is that they've come up with multiple documents that simplify the issue that we are working on, because it's a very complicated issue. In 15 minutes or 1 hour and 30 minutes, well, you will understand parts of it. But it's like an onion, you can keep peeling it one by one, and there are layers to the understanding of the issue. So 6 core principles must be understood in its base. First is that if anybody, whether within the UN or the implementing partner, is found to be guilty of sexual exploitation or sexual abuse, this act will constitute gross misconduct. Therefore, it can lead to their termination. Once you're terminated, you're also blacklisted and will never be hired back within the UN system. I must mention here that even for sexual harassment, we have zero tolerance. And if somebody is found to be responsible for sexual harassment, that person will also not be hired. We have a process called clear check, which basically then makes sure that the entire UN system is aware of that a person has been terminated because of sexual harassment. The second thing is that any sexual activity with anyone under the age of 18 is absolute no. Whether you can give reasons like, oh, I didn't know this person was less than 18 years of age. They lied to me. Their papers say they are more than 18. None of these reasons/excuses will be tolerated. No sexual activity should be generated with a child. And we are very clear that you may be serving the United Nations in another country where the age of consent is less than 18. Even then, you follow the WHO standards and you consider anyone under the age of 18 years as a child or a minor. Third thing, very important, that any form of transactional sex where you give something and you ask for a sexual favor is an absolute no-no for us. This could be that I'm going to the community, while serving them, I offer them food packets or any kind of sanitation packets and say, you know what, don't worry about it. You can get this for free. I will come home and deliver it. You just need to, and then you ask for a sexual favor. It's an absolute no-no. So much so that hiring sex workers for sex work is also prohibited, right? We are not discriminating against sex workers. We are saying if within a program you need to work with sex workers, please go ahead. In fact, there are programs within the United Nations that work extensively with sex workers. And that is not an issue. Here, it's about hiring them for sex work. So any form of transactional sex is an absolute no-no. In fact, to be very clear, we would like to ensure that any relationship we have as UN members, as implementing partners with the community should not be based on the abuse of power that we hold. Very clearly, when we go into communities, it's to serve them, which means they need us. They need what we bring for them, right? So very clearly, there is a power dynamics there. And therefore, we need to be very sure that we are not utilizing our power and generating any form of sexual relationship or sexual benefits from the community. As humanitarian workers, the fifth and the sixth core principle tells all of us sitting here right now, anyone and everyone who's in this room is actually directly or indirectly a UN representative. So for any of us, by the way, it is an absolute mandatory minimum that we report any concern, anything that we see, here, even if it's a gossip according to you or a story that has been told to you or discussed with you, anything that is related to an incident of sexual exploitation and abuse, we are supposed to mandatorily report. We will also talk about reporting in a little bit, but just to let you know that while reporting is mandatory, you're also protected because you can report anonymously. You can, under this particular SEA, you can even report someone else's case on their behalf. And there is a very important and a very strict no retaliation and whistleblower policy within the UN system, which we would like to use in a case such as this one. Even if you don't have any evidence, we actually tell people to report, right? Don't go out looking for evidence. That is not your job. Our job is to report. And last but not the least, make sure that you discourage all forms of sexual exploitation, abuse, and I would say even harassment. Now that we've been talking repeatedly about SE, SA, SH, let's quickly look at the definitions, and I'm going to request the organizers to let me know when my time is getting over, please. So sexual exploitation is actually...
We've got a couple of just minutes left.
Yes, please. Thank you, Abhishek. Really appreciate that. So sexual exploitation is when you are actually attempting or you've done something where you're using the vulnerability of the community and your power over them, and you're giving them something, and in return you're asking for a sexual favor, right? Similar to this, but a little different, is sexual abuse, where there is physical intrusion, which is of sexual nature, which means there is, of course, there is unequal power, but there is also coercion and coercive conditions that are being used here, which could be, let's say, attempt to rape, which could also be any form of sexual abuse of a child could fall into it. And these definitions, everyone should know, as similarly was mentioned earlier. This is been given to us by the Secretary General in a special bulletin in 2003. You may now wonder how sexual harassment figures in. Very similar to this, but different. Why? Because while SEA is us versus the community, for the UN staff, it's us versus us if it's sexual harassment. So if I, as a senior person, am bullying somebody, asking for sexual favors, intimidating them, creating a hostile work environment for them, right, whether once or multiple times, that will be termed as sexual harassment. It could be verbal, it could be non-verbal, it could be an ask for a sexual favor, it could also be a coercion that is being used. But mostly, sexual harassment is a terminology we use when it's somebody from the within the UN agencies, or well, let's say within UN agencies and implementing partners. That's the basic difference we have. Two laws that I must mention here are, and they have already been mentioned because Abhishek is an advocate, maybe he can speak a little later about it, is the POSH law, which very clearly came in 2013. You may have heard of Bhavi Devi's case. If you haven't, please read through it. And thereafter, Vishaka guidelines. And after that, after one PIL, we got a Vishaka guidelines, and after another PIL in the High Court, we got a law in 2013, which is very important. This law protects all women against any form of sexual harassment at the workplace, right? So it intersects very much with SEA work that we do. And child protection, specifically to do with POCSO, because this talks about protection of children from all forms of sexual offenses. This is an act that came into being in 2012. These two are very important, but also please note that there is BNS also exists, and there are various clauses that intersect with the PSEA work that we are doing here. But I'm not going to go into great details. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put it in your chat boxes or DM it to me and I will respond to it.
Yeah, ma'am,
I do want you. I'm sorry.
Ma'am, I would request you to conclude because you already passed to the time limit.
Yes, please. Yes, please. Thank you, Abhishek. So very quickly to conclude, not only are we looking at the UN system and also the implementing partners we are looking at when we want to make sure that there are concrete SEA policies. Therefore, most of the times when UN is asking an agency, or an NGO to join us as partners, we make sure that they have their own systems in place in terms of a policy, in terms of making sure they are vetting their people, they're training their people, they have their own reporting systems and investigative mechanisms. So what we are trying to do here is that we make sure that everyone who works with the United Nations takes this issue really, really seriously. At the end of my slide, there is an email ID that I will put into the chat box just in case someone needs to get in touch with me for any further clarifications. Thank you for having me here. Thank you, Abhishek. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Veenu ma'am, and thank you for kind of explaining us the concepts and its distinction in a very simplified manner, as well as giving the overview of the legal framework, and specifically about discussing the core principles and the UN system working. So thank you for that. And we will, at the end of all the presentation, we will have a collective Q&A session. So the participants can share their questions and we will address and take on each of them at once. Now, moving on to the second speaker, we welcome Malvika Goel ma'am. Sorry, Malavika Goel ma'am. She is a facilitator, curriculum developer, and gender practitioner with extensive experience in advancing feminist and right-based approaches. She has worked at the intersections of gender, sexuality, mental health, and the arts, using innovative methods such as dance movement therapy to create safe and inclusive spaces. Her expertise spans policy development on POSH and PSEA, as well as designing and facilitating sessions on identity, consent, pleasure, and inclusion. With an MA in Women's Studies and a diploma in dance movement therapy from TIS, Mumbai, Malavika has collaborated with diverse organizations including CREA, Rising Flame, Asoka University, and Work No Child's Business, contributing to gender transformative education and advocacy across India. Now I welcome Malavika for her talk, and the time limit is again the same 15 minutes. So yeah, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Abhishek. My name is Malvika, so you got it at the first go. And thank you so much for having me here, for like setting the context the way that you did. It was really lovely the way you talked about it, did the introduction, and thanks to Veenu as well for setting the basics right. In fact, I have actually been trained by Veenu on both POSH and PSEA, so it's quite an honor to be here. And like, I mean, every single time I think I must have attended at this point hundreds of your own PSEA. I don't think I ever get bored. So thank you so much for that. Without wasting any more time, I don't have a presentation. So I will just, I have a 10-minute talk sort of ready for you. And then of course, questions we can take on later. If at any point of time, anything is confusing, please put your questions in the chat as well. And I could also sort of address it there. Or if language is inaccessible, do let me know. So as I said, it is an honor, absolute honor to be here, because also I've been following the work of the other panelists over here as well. And the kind of work that is happening around PSEA and on PSEA that is happening is quite incredible. And I think over the past few years, I can see how much it has also sort of increased and how these names have also become so much more well known for me as well. Right. And I'm here to talk about something that is often pushed into the shadows, but it is very important to sort of shine some light on it, which is sexual exploitation and abuse in the disaster context, but specifically focusing on mental health support for survivors, right? And making sure that it is survivor-centric itself. When disaster strikes, whether it's a natural disaster or a man-made disaster, lives get torn apart. Especially during natural disasters, homes get torn apart, infrastructure, all of these things are generally destroyed. But along with that, they also tear apart our safety nets, right? They tear apart the systems that are usually operating on a day-to-day business, or on a day-to-day system. And in that chaos, people who are already living in the margins, as Veenu already talked about it, we have vulnerable adults, we have children, we have people with disabilities, we have women, we have trans people, we have several people who come from marginalized caste and class locations, Adivasi communities, who are already living on the fringes of society or are already in a space where they don't have a lot of power. Then they are the ones who face the highest risk of exploitation, right? And we've seen that over a period of time in the work that we've done. But alongside the physical dangers of this abuse, there is also a very quiet crisis that is happening. And especially during COVID, I think it became a very, very loud crisis, which is the mental health toll of any kind of disaster that can happen around us, with our loved ones. Now, add to that the layer of sexual exploitation and abuse. Anybody who goes through something like that, or even knows somebody else who's going through an incident like that, there is a mental health toll to it as well. There is a price to pay on that. And it is important that we talk about that when we are building these systems around prevention of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. Survivors are often carrying a lot of shame, they're carrying fear, silence, and not because they have done anything wrong, but because stigma is telling them to be very quiet. Stigma is telling them that their voices don't matter. And especially in a humanitarian situation where we might be also working, NGOs, organizations, UN organizations that are providing that aid, and they are the ones who are also the perpetrators of that sexual violence. Very often survivors will be told, hey, you're lying, right? Are you sure it is the same person who provided you with sanitary napkins, with food? Are you saying that they're the ones who have sexually exploited you? Power comes into play, right? And as again Veenu had mentioned, power plays a really, really big role over here. And which also means that a lot of times survivors don't want to seek out help. So today, let's also sort of reflect on how can we build partnerships which are collaborative, which are sustainable, which can sort of help us break this stigma, and partnerships that are ranging from governments to NGOs, which are also centering the communities themselves, trying to bring in international agencies as well to prevent SEA and to ensure that the support that we provide is survivor-centric and keeps mental health in mind. Right? Vulnerability is not a natural occurrence. It is something that is created by exclusion and power. Our systems are creating vulnerability. Our systems are creating that kind of exclusion. Therefore, people are out there on the margins, on the fringes. During the Kerala floods, I think this had happened in 2018. I mean, every year there are floods, but I remember this one situation in 2018, relief camps had no safe toilets, right? So camps were built, but there were no safe toilets at night. So there was no private space for women to go and to especially women who were new mothers who had to breastfeed, or anybody who wanted to use the washroom and required private space, that was just not available. And that risk is then higher for as I said, for a pregnant woman, especially if there is an openly queer person or a person even with a disability. That again, so that there is already a risk over there, there's already vulnerability over there. However, then there is a layer that gets added. So something that we can always do differently is ensuring whenever disaster strikes, when and we need to have this beforehand. This can't be right when the disaster strikes. When we are preparing for it, we need to make sure that our designs are inclusive, that our infrastructure is inclusive. Camps must have well-lit separate toilets, ramps for wheelchair users, and private spaces for women and children. Try having diverse staff, right? Again, it's very hard to call people at an emergency situation, but having women as frontline workers is extremely important. Having aid workers who are also disabled is going to be helpful in that moment, just to make sure that the community also feels included. And making sure that language is accessible. I think that is something that we need to make sure, and especially when it comes to sexual exploitation and abuse, because we are focusing on so many other needs that are very, very immediate. Very often we believe that sexual exploitation and abuse goes to the back of the head. If something comes up, they will probably bring it up. No, we need to put those mechanisms forward then and there as part of our aid processes as well, right? So complaint posters, putting up helplines, telling where you can put up a complaint has to be like part of the steps that we are doing when we are preparing for disaster, when a disaster occurs, or even when we are trying to reduce the risk of disasters. Very often, PSEA is also left in a file where whereas we consider real work is happening elsewhere, right? But it has to be within each and every stage of disaster risk reduction, right? So during our while we are preparing, train your responders. We need to train responders not just in logistics but also on gender, on sexual violence, on caste, disability inclusion. What is the impact of sexual violence, right? So we need to sort of do that, right? I think there is a module that I had come across for Philippines on disaster drills, which also included SEA preventions. I could share that with you as well. I think we should have that for India as well. I know UNICEF has been preparing some bits around disaster risk reduction and gender and looking at sexual violence, but we need to make sure that that is diverse. Ensuring that our aid distribution is transparent. I think using public distribution skills so that just misuse of power is minimized at all points. So we can also sort of look at different frameworks for DRR and to sort of bring in just the principles of inclusivity when we are trying to integrate PSEA in the larger framework of disaster risk reduction. And to ensure that this is survivor centric and to ensure that mental health support is provided, the biggest thing that we need to make sure is that silence is broken. There are a lot of other larger systemic issues at play, right? There are larger system, we don't probably have processes take too long. A lot of those things are there, and it's a step-by-step process. But the biggest step that we first need to take is to break the silence. We need to create a space where survivors can speak out, they are heard and they are believed, that they're not ridiculed for speaking out. And that needs to happen. So what does that survivor-centric approach look like? First and foremost is belief, right? If there is a person coming up to you and telling you that something has happened to them which is untoward, which is sexual in nature, don't respond with, "Are you sure that happened to you?" Even if that's a thought in your own head, that's fine. But maybe the first reaction has to be just checking in with the person. Are they okay in the moment? Are they feeling safe? If not, can they be put in a situation where they can feel a little safer and then take the next steps? Right? Believing is extremely, extremely important. The investigation, the inquiry, all of those things can happen later. That is not your prerogative in the moment. Your prerogative in the moment is that somebody in distress has come up to you and you have to provide them that comfort and that aid and the psychological aid in that moment of distress, right? So do not treat them with suspicion. Do not because they're probably gaslighting themselves. I can see Abhishek has also switched on his video. So I will take 2 more minutes and I will wrap up. Making sure like our reporting is confidential. So we can have helpline numbers, any kind of reporting which, whether we have community champions also in play, where people can report confidentially as well. Having mental health support, so this also requires us to have a referral list had struck. There was a huge Excel list of 200 mental health counselors across the country who were providing free aid, who were providing free counseling sessions. I remember even after that, a lot of times whenever disaster struck. So currently, when in Himachal, with the kind of floods that we are seeing and the rains that we are seeing, a lot of mental health professionals have come forward to offer their services, right? So the community does come together. So it's important for us to sort of do that. And it is important to remember that no single actor, no single organization, no single person can prevent this. It's not going to happen. They can be a driving force, they can be a trigger, but it bring in disability groups. We need to bring in people with lived experiences to come into this space and to give their input on DRR, to give their input on how to prepare, to give their input on what is survivor support like. As a non-survivor, there might be certain inputs, but it is important to bring in other survivors when we are creating these plans, right? Using things like suggestion boxes, WhatsApp groups, or even community meetings to check in whether systems are actually working. Once the disaster has occurred, it is very important to go back to the community after the aid has been provided to sort of see how the community is doing. Do not leave them after that. And do the check-in on sexual exploitation and abuse as well, not just on the aid front, right? Do the check-in on how they are feeling, how they are doing, right? Address it head on. Before I close, I would just want to ask you all something and leave you with this question. If a disaster struck your city tomorrow, right, wherever you're living, who would be the most invisible in that relief response? And what would you do personally or institutionally to make sure that that voice is heard, right? Because the heart of this issue is dignity. And SEA prevention is not just about avoiding the kind of harm that is being there, but also building justice and ensuring that it is there for accessible for everybody. So when we design inclusive shelters, enable accessible reporting, support survivors' mental health, and form real partnerships, not just with other CSOs and the government, but also with the community at the center and the heart of it, we will reshape society itself, right? Disasters will come again, and even more so now. Therefore, it is extremely important for us to emerge as a more compassionate and a kinder way, a kinder partnership, so that the communities that depend on us actually can, and that this risk of sexual exploitation and abuse is also reduced. So let's choose dignity, safety, and justice. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Malvika, and hope I am pronouncing your name correctly this time. So, as you mentioned about how we need to have this collective approach and specifically your focus on disability and inclusive perspective. So, this reminded me of a in the disability inclusion because I'm working in that sector. So, there's a concept called curb cut effect. So, when we make things accessible or universally accessible person with disabilities, here in case maybe the girls and women with disabilities, in effect makes it accessible for each and every other vulnerable communities. So that could be the way or the approach going forward, that we are leaving no one behind. And with that, we thank you, and we'll definitely explore that the question that you left us wondering about in the Q&A session, and we also have some couple of responses in the group chat. Now moving on to the our third presentation. This is by Ms. Sushmita Mukherjee, ma'am. She is, to give a small introduction about her, she is a senior global expert in domains of gender equality, social norms, and behavioral change communication. She has extensive work both in development and humanitarian settings. Since last more than 2 decades, she brings proven expertise in as practitioner, researcher, and academician to advocate gender transformative change across diverse contexts. Now I welcome ma'am to for her speech session, and ma'am again the reminder of 15 minutes for the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhishek. And thanks to all my previous speakers, Malvika and Veenu, for taking the context so strongly here. I would like to focus my sharing from the some of the community-based initiatives, and that would further enable us to learn from the learnings from and the experiences from some of the previous majorly identified humanitarian situations. As Madhavika presented, working in, the difference between the working in the humanitarian sector and in a regular development sector, the difference is the added layer of vulnerability, the added layer of like losing self, losing people, losing property. And great that the spot on the mental health issue was also brought in, because that becomes many a times the least concerned one in the entire humanitarian situation. When we look into humanitarian situations, there are two ways NGOs tries to work. One is that how do we prepare the community to become ready to face, like, there are many geographies in our country or globally where they know that there are going to be seasonal impacts of the climate change. And also currently, given the rise in the climate change impacts, uh, the entire earth and like 24 into 7 is going to become a humanitarian situation. I'll just quickly talk about that as an NGO. When we are working, it has to be from very seriously from the very beginning, that we are not only responding when a calamity has struck, that how we are also preparing the community for it. And many times the preparation is for the NGO themselves as well. So it has to be multi-pronged, multiple phase, multi-sectoral preparation that needs to be done. And we have to ensure, as Malvika said, from the very beginning, that our approaches are non-discriminatory and equitable. I would like to recall from the last question that Malavika shared to us, that how much do we really invest in studying our communities? How much as a humanitarian worker we are aware of our communities? And that's a basic homework. Have we done it correctly? Because then only you will be able to answer that question. Are we really encouraging the participation and voice of all sorts of demographies and the cohorts that are possible? Are we really making ourselves, our voices, our knowledge, our instructions accessible? I may be talking or I may be standing at a place in the community, seemingly that I see that this is the most accessible place, but that place may not be the most accessible for all these so-called voices that we are really concerned of. No doubt, safety, dignity, no harm is the first thing, and we cannot compromise on that. So in the humanitarian situation, intersectionality becomes a very high priority, because that's where one needs to be very careful that are we really there? Are we really able to identify the difference between the victims and those who are better privileged, who are the survivors who are better privileged or not? So the principles of including humanitarian action that was both talked by Veenu and Malavika has to be always in front of us as a community worker or a development humanitarian worker. Now, the other thing is that one is the entire preparedness. Are we really preparing, and what we are preparing for? The preparedness is for the self. The preparedness is for how do I act for myself? How do I act for my family? How do I act for my community? How do I then link it to the infrastructure and the policies or the supports? So one has to ensure that whenever we are building up the resiliency or preparing the community, it is structurally approach for undertaking all access. The another thing for the PSEA is, while there is a lot of awareness, while there we are putting in a lot of systems in place, the system of reporting in the form of transparent, in the form of without any fear of discrimination or in the fear of threat or fear of any kind of fear, we are able to give that space and platform for people to come out. And self-reporting is the lime test for us. If people, or if those who are survivors, those who are in that context, if there is a self-reporting improve, that really is a lime test that yes, your systems are really working, that is accessible, that is providing us confidentiality, that is survivor centered. There is a high level of trust. We all know that, when we are working in the humanitarian sector, the first thing that people lose is the trust to others, whosoever it is, like beyond, because of there's so much of fear of loss, and so much of loss and damage is already there. So protection of dignity, rights, and resilience is our key goal. So I would like to talk about that how we have seen the engagement with the women's collectives. We have South Asia, and particularly India, has the largest network of self-help groups. And these collectives, because of this largest network, is everywhere available. And now we are sitting at so many years of SHG movement in the country. I think those are the one of the best platform that needs to be harnessed, that needs to be capacitated and trained for this thing. Women's empowerment, women's involvement in any direction, has been already demonstrated to be successful. And I would say that there has been a lot of success coming out when we are using these structured SHGs, because these women have discipline, they know each other, they know the community, and there has been umpteen number of trainings already going on to them. So that's one big thing. The another is I would like to talk about is engagement of youth collectives. In India, we have Nehru Yuva Kendras, or there are other local youth clubs. So they also should be equally harnessed, given that we have a technological advancement already penetrated in India. So whatever it is, we must ensure that we are using that. While technology has its negative part as well, but let's use positive part, because these young people would already may have the connections, they may have their contact list in their mobile address books. So we have to ensure of leveraging those things. Why? Because it is the NGOs or it is the humanitarian sector workers. What is our aim? Because so that we are able to spread the messages of the safeguarding, we are able to talk about the practices, we are able to talk about what is the mechanism to build the trust, we are able to surface out the hidden issues that is causing any sort of obstructions to the any sort of accessibility that we have been all talking. We have to improve the reportings, discussions, sharing, experience sharing, insights, and everything. So I would talk about a little bit about some of the kind of known calamities. Like, for example, when we are in a humanitarian situation due to refugee problem, for example, in the Rohingya camp, we know that Rohingya camp is a big camp in the South Asia of the refugees in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. And when we are looking into the review of the arrangements there, initially we found that there were heavily underreporting of the sexual exploitation and abuse cases being happening in those camps. You all know. So I'm going to pick different kind of examples. So one is this, where your vulnerability is not a natural calamity, is a different type of political movement. And of course, because you have the loss is of different level altogether. So what worked there? What worked was not the kind of that, okay, there is a help desk or there is a phone or something like that. That did not work, because the sexual exploitation and abuse victims were not trusting anybody, that who is the trustworthy person to whom I can come, seek some advice, or even get some aid or treatment. So that's where the women's groups were started, pulling together. And we felt that, once the women's groups were pulled together, there was a request from women from almost all the households to come together to become members. And slowly, when the conversation started, the trust building improved, and that's where all the reporting started. So we need to understand that whom to involve in the community, so that we have the highest level of trust building, so that the reporting start. Because unless and until reporting start, we only be very theoretical in our approach, and we will not be able to understand the format of the crime, the format of the victimization that is happening, the format of the impact that is there on the on the persons. And I have already spoken about intersectionality, so I'm not getting into there. We all have discussed that there are different levels of vulnerabilities with people coming with different intersectionality. Next, let's take the examples of the Nepal earthquake. So during the Nepal earthquake, it was a natural calamity. Again, same, unprecedented. Of course, earthquakes are unprecedented, and we all know that Nepal was flooded with the international support there. But then, how do you engage with the local community? Language is one big thing, no doubt over it. But then, still, because of the losses, people were like, because it happens in the daytime, the elders were at the workplace, the children were at the school or somewhere else. So there was a lot of mess in that scenario because the families were not together at one place. So then we felt that how do we make sure? So what worked there? We try to pull together youth clubs and we try to put together adolescent girls clubs there, so that these clubs in these communities could be providing a safe spaces, because youth or adolescents themselves are a vulnerable cohorts. They were the best to really voice out if they find anything is missing, anything is not getting reported. So we felt that the youth clubs or the adolescent clubs are another biggest format that really work. And these are all micro solutions. You have to see, you cannot say only there are macro things. And then you can train these clubs of how do they can then elevate the problems to the upper levels. But because our victims are micro, our victims are rather nano as well. So that is why you have to have those micro, localized, contextualized solutions. Similarly, in the Amphan as well, we saw that in both the countries, whether it is India and Bangladesh, that the role of the self-help groups, the role of the women collectives was excellent. It was the women collectives who then found that this that the shelters did not had a proper toilets, or there was a water facility not available, there was no separate privacy not available. So hence, again, like coming back to that, if you engage the community leaders in that way, that really helps. um, then there was Ebola as well, or currently with the COVID as well. I think we have seen that if we build the community networks much more strongly, and cannot be to be very honest, that what happened between the difference between the Nepal and the Amphan was getting quite at least they gave us a lot of time to prepare the community there. And the women collectives were spoken about it, talked about it, they were given and all those things. And because the women collectives receive a lot of training otherwise, so the leadership was already there, which wasn't there in case of these unprecedented earthquake like situations. So as a worker, as a development worker and a humanitarian worker, where we have to work together, that how we are really working with our communities to improvise not only their engagement but also reporting. We have to ensure that there is a multiple point entry or reporting points. It's not one point and just available from 9 to 6. That's not how it works. How do you ensure 24 into 7? How do you ensure there are community focal points, and these focal points are really available across? If you plot your community, if you plot your shelter spaces, how these focal points are available across, and it should not be concentrated at one place. We have to ensure we are able to connect to the last mile person there as well, and to the least heard voice, and or without a voice as well. Are the spaces really safe? What do we mean by safe? Is it only physical safety? We need to talk more about the mental safety as well. We need to talk about the social safety. So when we do an audit of the safe spaces, we have to be careful that we are not only talking of the physical safety, but we are talking of really all aspects of the safety. And it's not our definition, it's the definition of the people who have taken the shelter there, or for whom it is being meant. So how much we are engaging with them to really understand what are their contextual vulnerabilities are all about, so that your reporting is improved. And once the reporting is improved, then only our strategies will improve. Otherwise, we would be only repeating some old strategies. So what I mean to say here is that when we are working with the community, we should not treat that awareness is just not like putting a poster or just miking. That's where you have to difference between, as a behavior change communication person, I would say that what is sending an aware information, and what is making the person or the community empowered, feel the agency, so that in the entire process they don't feel vulnerable, they feel that there is an agency, they are able to improve upon their situation. Because in the humanitarian sector, our motto is to build back them better so that their resiliency is improved. So whenever they are, like, God forbid, facing any crisis in the next in their life, they know how to act in, even if others, other assistance is not there. So how are we are making the people themselves to be more resilient, not only for themselves but also for their contextual near and dears? That's what should be the aim. And so I must say that the major challenges is the one is the physical and all those things, but stigma, retaliation fears, cultural silence and underreportings have been our major challenges. And increasing the trust through trusted leaders, survivor centered approaches of working into the communities, having our narratives very different. You know, many times we have a very victim centric narrative. So, how do we make sure that there is also respect in the way we use our words, the way we are talking to and addressing people, way we are identifying the people, way we are identifying the losses also? That needs a lot of narrative correction, so that the dignity is not only for as a dignity is not a charity that you donate there. So with that, I know Abhishek is back for us. So I would like, that how do we embed inclusion in the humanitarian action in every step of our thinking and working is something, is a call for action for me. Thank you. Thank you to Sphere India. Thank you, Abhishek, for this time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much, Sushmita, ma'am, for covering so insightfully the inclusive humanitarian action needs with the case studies of the West Bengal and different parts of India and global, as well as giving the community-centered need for PSEA and what are the possible ways can be used to can be employed to achieve that. Now we'll move to our last presentation by Ms. Rasmi Singh. And to give a short introduction about her, she's an independent consultant with over 26 years of experience in program development, policy advocacy, and capacity building on women's empowerment, gender equity, and diversity. She has worked with a wide range of organizations, including WaterAid India, Care India, Oxfam GV, Population Services International, and several grassroots NGOs and women's rights network in South Asia. Since 2014, she has been actively engaged as a freelancer, conducting training on rights based approaches, gender integration, women's economic leadership, and the implementation of laws on sexual harassment and child protection. She is also associated with the International Foundation for Crime Prevention and Victim Care, supporting women survivors of domestic violence. So over to you, Rasmi Singh, Rasmi ji, for the presentation. And again, we have the same time limit of 15 minutes.
Yeah,
Thank
sure.
you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Is the light behind me is distracting?
Little bit, but it's fine.
Otherwise, I can
Okay.
just pull the curtain. Do I do that?
No, it is okay. It's okay.
Okay.
I think okay.
Good evening, everybody. And I think most of the speakers, although I wasn't there for the entire webinar or the presentation, but what I could make out and looking at the agenda also, that a lot of things have been covered. In my session, I think largely what I'm going to cover is that, while we completely understand the context, and especially when we are looking at emergency or humanitarian context or disaster response, when it comes to PSEA and the UN's framework, it is very comprehensive in nature, where it actually encompasses the entire framework is more around prevention, prohibition, and redressal. So it is just not that when we are responding in an emergency situation or a humanitarian situation, it's not at that time, but the framework gives us enough support and gives enough mechanisms to us where we are well enough prepared when we are out there in the field. So in this session, largely I'm going to talk about the UN's core standards which are there. And if we are going to look at each of the standards, it starts right from the policies, the practices, building the culture, and then despite having policies and building a culture of awareness and prevention, there are chances that incidents will happen. Then how the organization or any agency is prepared to basically redress it, respond to it. Now, while I particularly talk about the response or the redressal part, especially when it comes to UN organizations, especially when it comes to UNICEF, because that's one of the agencies I have worked with. It's about not creating parallel systems to respond, but actually being as an enabler to activate and facilitate the functioning of the systems which are there of the government. So whether it is the child protection unit, or whether it is the one-stop crisis centers, or whether it is the legal authorities at the district or the state level. And the framework clearly says that it is not about, yes, internally within the organization, we do have a redressal system. But then when we go to that, okay, response services are needed, we don't create our own, but actually we support our partners to basically leverage the support services which already exist at the various levels. Because then it also is that we all know that, especially when we look at the government agencies and the response system, um, maybe they are not that effective or functional. But then if we take that route, it actually increases their accountability. We are able to hold them more accountable and activate them. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to quickly, can I share my screen, Abhishek?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay,
I think you are must be allowed for that.
okay.
Just keep make it the slideshow so it is much more accessible for people.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank
So
you.
are you able to see my screen?
Yes, ma'am. It is perfectly
Okay.
fine.
So here, basically, when we look at the standards, as I was telling that the six standards which are there of the UN, and since Veenu is already here, and I'm sure she must have spoken about it. These standards actually, one is that help in creating, a more a safe and it's more about proactive in nature, this framework, rather than reactive. So it's basically helps to create an environment of safety and respect. So, and whether it is, in a development mode we are working, or we are working in a humanitarian or a disaster response. The framework actually ensures any organization commitment to making it like it is zero tolerant. The way the whole core standards are, and it's just not about these standards, but it's also about that, how the UN system is linked to making these standards a mandate. So, and one of the ways in which the UN does is, for example, is, I mean, it's not a very, I wouldn't call it very punitive, but then that's how, people can become more accountable and take it more seriously, is that, you have to basically abide by, fulfill, and implement all the standards. And it is actually sometime linked to, let's say, your grant disbursement. So, yes, initially it might be that one is doing out of force, out of compliance. But as these systems get embedded and institutionalized, the compliance shifts to culture change, practice change, and norm change. The other we look at is that basically these standards help to, not only they are linked to a particular organization or context, but the way these standards have been framed, they are applicable more at a global level and in diverse contexts. So whether we are in the development context or we are in a humanitarian disaster context, they are relevant in all cases. These standards are basically also, committed to addressing some of the root causes. So, because when we are going to look at some of those standards, they actually focus a lot on building communities and the staff's awareness, and through that awareness process, bringing a mindset shift and an attitude shift. So, it's not basically looking at that, okay, when it will happen, then what will we do? But then making people reflect that what could be some of those very subtle, very normalized behavior which can amount to exploitation and abuse, and how they are not okay. So they work, the standards work at eradicating them from the eradicating SEA from its root cause. um, and it is an overarching program commitment. It is a very integral part of any program design. So while we are not only looking at it as a compliance, but how the different program strategies or in a program are going to have addressing, responding, preventing SEA as part of the program design. It is also and especially when we look at UNICEF, then it is because it works with, especially with children. It is also aligning to its commitment to child protection, and then of course it is an enabling and an operational commitment as well, because it's also part of the admin and the HR compliance system. Now, quickly, if we look at some of these standards, as I said, the standards can be divided into the policy, then maybe bringing a culture shift and awareness, and then the last part is the respond. So first one is, or the first core standard is that it actually helps the partners, helps the UN organizations to make sure that there are all these policies. There's a list of policies which are given in the compliance board, and where these policies are mandatory. So you are going to get your scores only when you have the policy. Now what happens is that how the policies also help. One is that of course you have it on paper, but apart from that, to the community members, to our stakeholders, to our staff, if an organization has these policies, and they when they join the organization or they get on board, it just gives a very clear message about the organization's commitment, that these are policies, and the organization is very serious about some of these issues. So there are policies which are on the code of, so there is a code of conduct. So you make sure that your the violation of, or the conduct of SEA is one of the misconducts listed in the code of conduct of the organization. Because normally when an action is taken, it is taken under the larger ambit of the code of conduct. So it makes sure that it is one of the misconducts. Then having an explicit policy on SEA, then is that when people are actually getting onboarded, making sure that at the time of the induction, the organization ensures that people read the policy, they sign on to it, and then maybe there can be brief orientations as well. um, the second standard focuses again on further deepening the institutionalizing of the PSEA mechanisms. So here it is more about that how the HR systems, particularly, and the organization management can embed this entire issue within its HR systems and practices. So whether we are issuing contracts, whether we are doing reference checks, or whether we are putting out in the entire recruitment process or onboarding, or we are, let's say, developing TORs, then it is very much part of, where it just doesn't say that we are zero tolerant, but then what, as a consultant, or as a staff member, what's your responsibility? Or suppose, let's say you are working as a volunteer during a humanitarian response. So it is part of, it's just not that, okay, a policy is given, but it is part of your TOR, and TOR is something which you are, you're held accountable to. Then we look at the third. Again, the third score standard, as I said, that after the first and the second, the third one is that it basically gives a mandate to the organization, any organization, whether it is UN or its partners or any of its stakeholders, that there are planned training programs which are more on perspective building, internalization, building people's understanding on what kind of behaviors constitute, sexual exploitation and abuse. It is a very and there are already training modules, so you don't have to reinvent the meal, and it's already there, and they are very practical, pragmatic, scenario based kind of, so that people are able to look at these some of these issues in their real time context. And again, all of these standards, they, although you can see on the screen where you say you need to have a training plan, so these are some of the indicators that these are happening. So if you look at all the core standards, the way they have been drafted, and they are so comprehensive that it is just not about that you put a tick, but then there is a concrete evidence that some of these processes are in place. Then we look at reporting. Again, it mandates the organization to have a very, very clear reporting process. And during the awareness and the training program, it has to be ensured that people are completely aware that what is basically the reporting process. And then it mandates the organization to have a whistleblower policy, a clear reporting mechanism, and especially when it comes to SEA within UNICEF, and when we look at other UN organizations, especially when an incident happens in a community, then there is a mechanism well in place where it says directly it goes to the focal point within UNICEF, so that there is no kind of distortion of the data or dilution, or maybe then the issue gets not addressed. So the mechanism has been developed in such a way, and it should be developed so that it doesn't has to cross through multiple levels, that if the complaint has come, or maybe the whistleblower is going to raise a concern. Then if we look at, as I said in the beginning also, that it is not about creating parallel systems, but we say how do we activate and make the existing systems and the response system of the government more functional. The core standard 5 actually is around that. One is that the organization, we have a ready list, or as a ready reckoner or a referral guide, where we know that, okay, these are the support services or the service providers. We are aware their contact numbers are updated. Then there is also a case referral mechanism, because especially when it comes to cases of SEA and these issues, they had maintaining and ensuring confidentiality is something which is a must. In the referral process, this is something very much important, that it is clearly laid down that, okay, if an incident has happened, and then if it has to be referred to, let's say, the child protection officer, or if it is a case of domestic violence, then it has to be referred to the one stop center. But then how it is going to happen, what kind of information, how much information is going to be passed, that's something which is part of the referral, the guidance. And then also there is a referral form for the survivors, and all these templates which are there. And then, of course, this is something very important, is the investigation. Now, this core standard says that the organization should have a process to investigate. Now, what we have seen, and especially when I was with UNICEF and even with other organizations, now let's say an organization is working on, on an issue, and where they are not working on, let's say, on an issue of or violence, or child protection or sexual abuse. Then what do you do in that case? Because maybe one is not expert in doing casework or handling cases or investigation. So this core standard says, yes, it is good to have an investigation committee. Like if you look at the POSH Act, it does mandates the organization to have an IC. But when it comes to SEA, and let's say then it is mandatory that we can also have, a collaboration or a contract with a specialist organization who can be onboarded when an investigation needs to happen, or maybe have some specialists on the panel. So I think these are the core standards, and I would say that these are um,
Lakshmi, you want to cover also the 7th and the 8th with due apologies? Just talk about how, investigations and corrective measures are to be built in. I had
yeah.
spoken about the 8th, but never explained it. So it's great that you have.
Yeah, so it is not there on my slide. For some reason, it is not showing. So basically, again, it is like when the investigation has been done, then there is a lot of learning which comes, right? And when that learning comes, then what are some of the corrective measures and the learnings which are emerging? You integrate that. I think that's something very important, because often it happens is that you have taken the action, but then what it means to the organization for it to reflect back, and maybe then look at that, okay, what are maybe the corrective measures we want to take in terms of training, what we want to take in terms of our policy, or maybe we want to take in terms of let's say the investigation process per se. So that standard is around that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rasmi ma'am, and thanks to all the other speakers as well, Veenu ma'am, Rasmi ma'am, Sushmita ma'am, and and
Malvika.
Malvika. Yeah. Now we are opening for the Q&A, and before going that, I was going through my own research work that also there's a case by the Supreme Court of India in which it gave a guidelines, the Patan Valley versus the state of Andhra Pradesh, where they made the how the sexual harassment or the abuse and violence, especially against the women with disabilities, and how they provided guidelines which included so many other things, but one of the main guidelines was documenting and creating disaggregated data so that the decision making processes become much more concrete and scientific and fact based. So that I would like to understand from any of the speakers that how the data collection and its based decision making is done in with respect to the abuse and sexual exploitation, and how interrelated it is with the violence against women in the context of the cases of disasters and humanitarian crisis, as well as the conflicts, like there's so many global conflicts that are going on, and they have very, although have a different concept, but the disasters, post disasters, or the humanitarian crisis or the conflicts have very similar nature. So yeah, if anybody would like to take that question to begin with.
Sure, I can go with the data
Sure.
one. So, Abhishek, I'm not very aware of the case that you were referring to,
Yeah.
but yes, data-driven strategies I would like to talk about. That we have been talking of intersectionality, but if
Right.
we are talking of intersectionality, then that has to be part of our data management system as well. So, for example, like basic we need for let's say how many men or how many women are there, how many young people are there, how many adolescents, and all those things are there. Now let's say if we come to the people with special needs, then we need to understand that what are the kind of special needs that are there, and we talk of shelter homes, we talk of the assistance to be provided. And if I am not aware as a service provider that what is the requirement of my community, like whom I am like standing here to support, and how my support is really a support. So that's where it is very essential that we have the data disaggregation by identifying the special needs. It can be having a special need for a woman who is currently pregnant, a woman with young children, a woman with who is a widow but no support, an old age person. Then there is all sort of other people who have special needs. So if I do not map out all these things, then I cannot map out my support services as well. So that's where the data driven decision making I can give you an example of.
Yeah.
Can I
Thank you
just
so much
add
for
to this, Abhishek?
Yes,
It's
please, ma'am.
really quite weird that we're talking about data-driven strategy. And if you look at the data that we have from the past, let's say about 4 years, because I've had the privilege to work with UNICEF earlier for 2 years, 1.5 years, and then 3 years I've been steering this network. And because we are talking prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse specifically, 2017 till today, the last 8 years, the actual data of PSEA cases is not even 10 cases that have been reported in India. So the biggest issue here is that when it comes to and let's not forget the definitions, which is why I put them into the conversation today in the agenda, is that when you're looking at a UN employee or an implementing partner using their power over the vulnerabilities of the community, when it comes to that, the community is not even informing us as to what is going on. And anybody who's lived in India, I was born and brought up here, I've spent 5 decades here, and I can tell you that there is a huge amount of sexual exploitation abuse that must be going on. That's my personal opinion. Having said that, it's a huge red flag, and we very often within the UN system, we've been discussing how big a red flag it is that there are not even 10 cases in the whole of 8 to 9, 10 years, that I have the data with me. So here, it's actually been counterproductive in a way that when I talk to people or when I start conversations on how we need to have, either capacity building or an SOP being created or any other, or for that matter, a helpline, right? In between, we were talking about having a number which is dedicated to cases of SEA. And the issue that was stopping all of us was that there are no cases, right? So how do you actually, for let's say 1 case a year or 2 cases a year, how can you have a dedicated helpline or how can you have dedicated resources? So it's our work in India is much more preventive and proactive. And one must remember that just because there is no data or just because there are no cases, it does not mean that there is nothing happening at all. It means that there are things that are being kept under the wraps by either people in position of power, or for that matter, that the community is too scared and much more vulnerable than you can think of and are not being able to report, or your systems are not accessible even after you've tried so hard. So that's more the issue here.
Right, exactly. Thank you so much, ma'am. I would like to read couple of comments that we have received in the chat box. So the first one is Dani Aziz. He says, a good way is to have PSEA reporting mechanisms built into the response strategies. Make sure there is a PSEA focal, have means to report, and most of all, awareness of the target audience.
So very quickly, Danish is absolutely right. I believe he's from, or they are from UNICEF, and UNICEF and all other UN agencies, as Rashmi's just presented, not only do we have our own systems in place and our focal points, we also insist that anyone who partners with us in whatever capacity, short term, long term, doesn't really matter, every single organization that is a partner with any of the UN bodies is meant to have 1 or 2 focal points. And I personally actually train all focal points. Rashmi's been a great trainer to UNICEF. So we've made sure that practically everybody within the UN system is covered either through trainings or through town halls or through just making sure that awareness material is reaching out. So we make sure that there are focal points. It's a great suggestion. Thank you, Danish.
Yeah, thank you. I think Malvika is having some technical issues with the video, so hope it gets resolved, and then she can also join and answer through this Q&A session. Also, we have a comment from Rihanna Afroz. Could you please explain how person with disabilities are identified? Are there any tools available for this purpose? I think I would like to answer this question. So there is a Right to Person with Disabilities Act of 2016, which identified 21 types of disabilities, and these are recognized or rather assessed through medical system that is in place at every district level. So apart from that, Malvika says that I am here, just issues with the video. So if
I,
any other audience, people, participants who would like to ask the question, please feel free to unmute yourself or ask or put in the chat box.
Abhishek, I'd actually
Yeah,
like to add one more thing about
sure,
like
please. Please.
disability identification. I mean, of course, the guidelines by the Supreme Court are extremely exhaustive, but another thing that also helps is self-identification. So, especially when you're doing an audit within the community, whether it's before, after, however, it is always helpful to sort of ask the person whether they, and that's with disability as well. That's also with gender and sexual orientation, where you ask the person themselves, because there are a lot of invisible disabilities that also exist, that people that may not be listed, right? A lot of intellectual disabilities, neurodivergence, that does not show up in a lot of these formal lists. So it's also important to sort of keep those into account as well. So just wanted to
Yeah.
add that point.
I would like to give a little contrary perspective to that, although I
Hmm?
agree in the principle,
Hmm?
just that after the Khedkar case where the disability certificate fake
Hmm?
making and the SOJ is huge issue. So for availing services and for the pension and so many things, it becomes a huge challenge within the disability sector also, that how
Absolutely.
self-identification, as well as the point that you mentioned specifically regarding invisible disabilities, they cannot be identified just for on the seeing by them, as well as the intellectual disability, that is very valid and very pertinent and important. But again, we need to strike a balance given how the fraud is also going there, especially because the reservation policies are there for person with disabilities. So yeah, over to you, Rasmi ma'am. You have, I think, some point to raise. Yeah.
Yeah. So this fake and false and malicious
Yeah.
is something is most talked about whenever it comes to laws and policies, especially for women, or something like this. And we say, okay, misuse will happen, fraud will happen, and but then if we look at the unfortunately the ones which are maybe malicious, they are highlighted the most, and they do like a disservice. But I would say that every time, when I do training, the first question is, but what about the cases which are like false, and or the misuse? And
Yeah.
I would say, okay, in India, which is the law which is misused the most? And then it is actually the income tax law. What do you do with it? Do you get rid of it, or you make it stringent? So why this question, and why this should worry us so much when it ever comes to misuse होगा misuse का percentage बहुत बहुत कम है than the actual number of incidents which are happening. Let the misuse happen, that's fine, we'll deal with it, but our focus should not go into misuse. And
Uh,
I completely align with self identification, because disclosures are very, very difficult. Especially when it comes to gender identities, there is a lot of stigma. It is just not stigma, but it's also about violence. There is a lot of stigma which is around mental health. So, and we come from a culture of silence. So when Veenu was saying, and I completely align with her, that there are hardly any cases reported, and just because
yeah.
cases are not being reported, that means it doesn't mean the incidents are not happening. That means there's something wrong with us, that it's
Yeah,
not happening.
definitely. Principally agreed on that. We have a question raise have hand from Rehana Froza, but before that, we have also comment from Kumari Priya. So I will take the question from the comment section before, and then we have the question from Rehana. So Kumari Priya, ma'am, there are so many women emergency helpline numbers, but they are of no use. The people who are designated to safeguarding women not doing their work but forcing women to take back these complaints. What could be done regarding this? Isn't this a reason that there are less reporting of sexual abuse cases? What are remedies available to general public? So yeah, anybody who
Yeah,
interested
I
to take
can
it.
say that from
Yeah,
a experience from working in the community. That's a hard reality for the country. And so that is why, the working with the local community collectives is very essential. That's why I mentioned, for example, if you're working with women's collectives, how do we ensure that they are more and more strengthened? The voice of the collectives give you the strength of power in numbers, and that allows you to amplify your voice at that level as well. So if the system doesn't work, then you have to work with your community-based systems, and they are being laid, and we need to really strengthen them and harness their powers. Thank you.
yeah. Thank you so much, ma'am, for that
Um,
answer.
I'd like to also add to that. I think, Sushmita, what you said is so incredibly true. And as you said, it's a hard reality. Along with that, I mean, one aspect of remedies is the justice aspect of it. One aspect is of redressal and what do we do in terms of punishment and holding people accountable. But another part of support and remedies is also just providing a space for the survivor, which might just be community support as well, which might just be support in terms of any kind of health support, or even, again, as I said, as I was talking about, mental health support, for them to have a space to even express and then heal, right? Even if the justice aspect is delayed or not sort of happening, or even if they choose not to report due to the processes and the issues that are there in the processes, it does not mean that healing for the person has to stop or has to be something that has only happens when justice is served. I think that's one of the things that we often find when we're working with survivors, where a lot of systemic issues are not within our hands, but what is very often within our hands is how is it that we can make sure that they feel comfortable, that they are empowered, or that they're feeling that they can now move ahead in their lives as well, is something that we can also focus on. So just so, I mean, that is something that also has come up for me personally. So just wanted to throw that in.
That's so true. And thank you for saying that to Malvika. Now over to Afroza. I think she was having a question. So please unmute yourself and ask. Rihanna, Froz. Okay, till she, I think, become able to unmute herself and ask the question. I would
Sorry,
like to
Rihanna
ask.
is saying I'm not allowed. Can you allow me? So it looks like she's asked to unmute. Let me see. Rihanna, see if you can see a message from me saying ask to unmute.
uh,
Yes.
yeah, I have.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
Yes.
thank you. I'm Rihan Afruz, working as a protection technical specialist. I'm in Bangladesh now, and I'm asking the question about the disaggregated data. I have some not the suggestion. I shared the experience which we already doing in the camp level or the in Bangladesh for identify the person with disabilities. We are using the Washington group questions for identify the person with disabilities because person like itself maybe not identified that I am that disability, or sometimes not like speaking that I have some disability like that, and sometimes like intellectual impairment or other impairment or disabilities are not like seeing watch or seeing as much. So I think it would be the great tools to identify the person with disabilities if you have like integrated in the meal or the identify the disaggregated data you have. Like if it's a women men, then you can separate it like men with disability, men without disability, like that, or female with disability, without disability. So how much number you have, then you if you use the Washington group questions, then it will be identified. And this is the suggestion or the experience we have. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rihanna, for that insightful addition to the conversation. Before anybody else has any question, that I would like to ask one this, that how this abuse and sexual exploitation also leads to not just dignity, loss of dignity, and so much more the deprivation of rights, but also leads to loss of agency and kind of infantilization of the victims or the survivors. So how that can be dealt from a the approaches that we are applying?
Yeah, I also brought in that. So we have to look into humanitarian aspect from multiple perspectives. Let's start let's start with the sequence. Like, if we have to prepare, then we have to help them to sense and then respond and then rehabilitation. If we go with that sense, so while we are preparing them, we have to ensure that we are preparing them to be resilient. So hence it should not be information dumping. No beneficiary, no receiver, no learner is an information dumping ground. But all our activities, the way we are mobilizing them, it should be empowering for them so that they continue to remain motivated and their abilities are improved. So that when they are in any sort of crisis, whether it's a humanitarian crisis or in a development crisis, then they should be able to take those prompt and required action, because that is very essential. So hence it is very essential for us to, whosoever people with whatever intersectionality, they should feel empowered. And it is empowered is not only self, how they are also building a community and ecosystem around them, which is also reciprocated to them. For example, I as a queer person may be feeling very confident of dealing to in such a situation, but the moment I am just stepping out of my space, because that environment, the ecosystem is not there so much enabling to me, my confidence level will be like, going down immediately. So hence, where we invest a lot on individual level ability improvements, we have to invest similarly on the ecosystem level ability improvements as well, so that a balanced reciprocity can also work together to maintain that agency and to maintain that intent of empowerment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sushmita ma'am. So if anybody else has their last comment, so they can chip in because we are already 10 minutes late. So then I would like to over to the Sanchita for closing remarks and concluding the session.
Good evening, everyone. On the behalf of Sphere India Academy, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to all of you for joining today's webinar, organized in collaboration with UN India. Your active participation has made this session truly meaningful. In the context where disasters exacerbate vulnerabilities and heighten the risk of exploitation, your commitment towards safeguarding dignity, ensuring credibility, accountability, and promoting survivor centered approaches is invaluable. A special thanks to our distinguished speakers, Ms. Veenu Kakkar, Ms. Malvika Goel, Ms. Sushmita Mukherjee, and Ms. Rashmi Singh for the insightful presentation and talks on legal frameworks, collaborative partnerships, inclusive humanitarian action, and institutional accountability for PSEA. Your expertise has enriched our understanding and provided practical pathways for integrating safeguarding into disaster preparedness and response. We are deeply grateful to our moderator, Advocate Abhishek Kumar, founder of the Sangyan, for steering the discussions with clarity and thoughtfulness, ensuring a very dynamic and engaging dialogue. To our participants, policy actors, humanitarian practitioners, academicians, community leaders, and young professionals, thank you all for joining us today, for your presence and contributions. Your engagement reinforces the urgency of embedding PSEA into disaster risk reduction and humanitarian programming, ensuring dignity, safety, and inclusion for all. We look forward for your continued participation and involvement in the upcoming Sphere India Session Academy as we collectively advance resilience, equity, and safeguarding in humanitarian action. Stay safe, stay committed, and thank you once again for joining us today. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.